As you'll know, by the last few days of this hybrid conference, PACE is looking at the causes of populist movements, the challenges they pose to liberal democracy, and looking at developing new tools to identify track populist narratives, social simulations to study and respond to the phenomena. As part of our work, the project has a commitment to make some policy recommendations. In this presentation, I'll be talking you through some of the thinking we did around the ethics of that. Some of the issues that emerge in making policy recommendations from research in general, and the specific context of making policy recommendations in the field of populism, a field where there's been explicit critique of expertise and experts and their role in policymaking and politics in general. That's our format for this morning. I think about half an hour talking and then some discussion time. A little bit about, jumping ahead. A little bit about me. I'm a senior research manager at Trilateral Research. I'm in the policy, ethics, and emerging technologies team. What I do is I contribute to putting together large multidisciplinary research projects, often those looking at new technologies. My work is often about the politics of new technologies or the societal impacts of new technologies, or managing research ethics within those projects. PACE is a nice, I've been doing lots of stuff on security technologies and surveillance technologies, but PACE is a nice return for me because originally my academic background was in politics. So it's been really nice to spend some time in a project with people who stayed in that field and specialize in that field and I know what they're talking about. It's been a refresher. So on the slide, you'll see some of the other contributors to this work. Our director, David Wright, Annie Shreshigbe, and Matt Hall, who have worked with us on this work. A little bit about Trilateral Research. We are a research consultancy and technology development company based in the UK and in Ireland. We're about 100 people strong now, and about half of that are directly facing at kind of the research world. The other half are provide data protection services, corporate consulting, develop new technology, develop AI and machine learning approaches themselves. But it's an interdisciplinary company, so there's flow between those two sides. As part of our research work, we do, and commercial work, we do regulatory and policy advice, often in the field of new technologies. And we're quite heavily invested in the worlds of privacy and data protection. We are involved in quite a lot of European Union research projects across a wide range of topics, often contributing from a social sciences perspective or a legal and ethical perspective. The work we've been doing in PACE, I guess I'll give you a little bit of background on our overall approach to ethical, legal, and societal impact assessment. The main priority of this work is to build the trust that people have in the project, right? So to show that we're doing things in an appropriate manner, meeting our legal and ethical commitments, and just doing kind of like good quality research that people can be confident about relying on and sharing. So the ethical approach is intended to kind of build the trust that stakeholders have in our work. As part of that, we've worked to identify the kind of the ethical, how to meet the ethical requirements on us as a funded research project, but also to identify kind of things that are important to us as well. And the general objective then is to improve the project's outputs. So the tools it's making, so for example, the dashboard, you might have seen it yesterday, and improve the policy recommendations that we'll be talking about today by ensuring they have a high ethical standard and that they meet the needs of the people they're intended for. Our tools for doing this included initially an ethics handbook. So a sort of internal report setting out kind of our approach to managing ethics, kind of the things in the project that needed a bit of focused attention, but also I think quite importantly, setting out a set of agreed ethical principles. And this was something that was discussed at our very first kind of consortium meeting. It was like, these are a set of ethical principles and this is what we're going to sort of stick by. And I think we see the influence of those principles through the rest of the work that we're talking about here today. We had a dedicated ethics monitoring task where we at Trilateral worked with the other partners in the project to try and anticipate any kind of ethical issues in their work, support them as they went through ethics approval processes, and just generally kind of, keep a sort of a second pair of eyes on this topic. And then the substantive piece for us is some dedicated LC work, so ethical, legal, societal impact. on the project's outputs, on 3 of the project's outputs. So we did a report on kind of the issues around the ICT tools, so the data protection issues, things like that. We did a study looking into kind of the ethics and the politics of public engagement work, so the democracy labs and so on. And what I'm going to talk to you about today is the issues in the policy recommendations work. The aim with all of these, our approach with these LC tasks is generally to try and do them early, to try and work with the partners who are responsible for that work, to try and understand their intentions and their plans and how they're going to go about doing that, so that we can, alongside that, have a think about what the potential kind of ethical issues might be, legal and societal issues as well, and try and surface those and get into a discussion with the people doing the work. They are experts in their domain, but we're just providing a second set of eyes. So 3 things we're going to talk about today. 1, the ethical issues in making policy recommendations from research in general, presented as a set of 6 questions that a project should ask itself. Then the ethical issues that emerge from making policy recommendations in this field of populism. And finally, I'll present you with a summary of the recommendations we made to ourselves to the project about policy recommendations. So a little bit meta, but recommendations about recommendations. So these are the ethical issues in policy recommendations. As I said, they're a set of questions which we think any project could address to itself. The first question: why do we want to make policy recommendations? So understanding our motivation, our intent behind making policy recommendations, or in fact any intervention into policy processes, is a very important part of understanding the ethics around them. So if we're being honest, we have, any given project, any given piece of research will have a mix of sort of normative aspiration, aspirational motivations, and some kind of practical, pragmatic ones. So on the slide there, I'm not going to, well, maybe I will go through them, but there's a set of reasons that kind of run from the having a positive and practical impact on the world, making a contribution to public good. Perhaps we have in other research identified a policy problem or a situation that could be improved with some input from research. Scientifically, perhaps we want to test our models and assumptions about how the world works by putting them into practice, seeing if they hold true. Pragmatically, maybe we want to build or maintain a career or reputation as an expert in a particular field. We often should be looking to justify the public resources used to conduct the research, right? So it's now commonplace for policy dissemination to be included in research projects. Research institutions often have policy dissemination role as part of their organizational mandate, and Horizon 2020 projects such as PACE are assessed at the proposal stage upon their potential for impact, right? And providing inputs to policy processes can be an important avenue for research impact, particularly in the social sciences and humanities. Sometimes policy recommendations are explicitly requested or commissioned by a policy actor or a policy maker, and sometimes, like we do at Trilateral, you can provide policy recommendations as a commercial service. So different partners within the consortium may vary within a project, may very well have different motivations, different mandates, but they're also operating in different kind of policy contexts. They're in different national or regional environments, and having that discussion about what our kind of motivations are, how they potentially conflict, where they can reinforce each other by people taking slightly different strategies is a very worthwhile discussion to have for a project. Second question, what role do we want to play in this policy process? Why, how are we going to, what is the ambition for our policy recommendations? So I've got 2 categories here, which I think sort of overlap, right? So in 1982, Hank Jenkins Smith had these 3 categories of scientists engaging in the policy process. So there are objective technicians. These are people who simply and objectively want to pursue the best means for the most efficient program. They are kind of interested in the process and the science. There are issue advocates. They are people who are concerned with advancing the cause of, a set of their stakeholders, their beneficiaries. So this might be interest groups, or it might be kind of industry lobbyists or something like that. And then there are client advocates who are literally paid to, lobbyists really, who are technically paid to protect and advance their employers' interests. Roger Pielke has a slightly more sophisticated breakdown of 5 ideal types, one of which is the stealth issue advocate is to be avoided, but the others are available and appropriate in different circumstances. So these are kind of categorized based on your view of democracy, whether democracy is basically typified by interest group pluralism, so different interest groups kind of communicating and interacting in a relatively open space, or if it's typified by conflict between elites. The other axis is your view of science in society. So how do science and society interrelate? So one option is a kind of linear model where science produces knowledge, and that knowledge then sort of feeds through into society in a pretty linear way. And the other way of looking at science and society is a much more networked stakeholder model where the activity of science is shaped by society as well as influencing it. So that gives you 4 types. It gives you the pure scientist, the issue advocate, the science arbiter, and the honest broker of policy alternatives. Now, Pielke's book was called The Honest Broker, so I think we can understand which one he favors. For Pielke, pure scientists don't really exist because of real world demands for impact from research and having kind of relevance to your research. They don't really exist. There's no such thing. If they did exist, they might well be typified by design not to engage with policy processes. So these are maybe people who are like, I'm not interested in policy, I just want to do science. The science arbiter are those researchers who want to provide support to decision makers by providing answers to specific questions coming out of the policy process that can be answered empirically. So using scientific tools and methods. So this is, for example, often the role of expert advisory committees. We've had a lot of these recently within the pandemic. They become very kind of public. The committees of scientists that are providing input to governmental decisions. Issue advocates are people who aim to reduce the scope of choices in the policy process, right? So ideally down to one favored outcome. It's sometimes seen as negative within scientific research, sort of slightly tainted, slightly biased. But for Pielke, at least, scientists are also citizens. Researchers are citizens and should be allowed to play a role in advocating for things they believe in. There is an open question about how much public funding you should use to do that. Finally, the honest broker is defined by Pielke as a desire to clarify or even sometimes expand the scope of options available for action. So they are aiming to empower a decision maker by clarifying what is possible, including identifying choices that were previously kind of unidentified or unseen. So offering new options. How about this? Have you tried this? And then Pielke is critical of this 5th type, the stealth issue advocate. They are an expert who seeks to hide their issue advocacy, behind the appearance of being a pure scientist or a science arbiter. They're dangerous because in doing that, they politicize science and give science and politics a bad name. Okay, so there's a open question about what can we make recommendations about. A real risk with providing expert input into policy processes is this halo of expertise, right? This is the idea that you have a core of knowledge and expertise that is based upon your research or upon your and then a wider penumbra of things that you could talk about. So as a project, we have to be very clear, what do we have evidence for from our research? What are the still open questions? And what are the areas where we don't actually know anything about, but we're just acting like a normal politically interested citizen? PACE's legitimacy as a research project to give advice into the policy process rests upon the research work in the project, as well as the antecedent work by others that we rely on, and previous research work by the researchers. So it's important to be kind of very clear about that. This touches on to a broader set of questions about can we as a research project be objective, and should we? So often the rationale, the legitimacy for inclusion of scientific knowledge and expertise into policy processes is this idea that it's in some way objective. It's not politicized. It's more sort of untainted by interests. Now, for various reasons, that's a sort of unsustainable position. Scientists have interests, researchers have interests, be that funding, people having moved into a field that they're interested in, various other kind of cognitive biases as well. So there's a risk that leaves us kind of without this kind of objectivity. Then where's the legitimacy? And it's really, really difficult to separate out pure kind of information from value-laden positions, especially in fields like the one we're working in. There are a couple of hopes in this field, though. So Longino suggests that objectivity doesn't come from individual scientists, but rather comes from a scientific community open to scrutiny, able to challenge each other's work and look at how it was done. And it's from that collective process of science that we get objective inputs into policy process. Similarly, Munich suggests that value-laden nature of expert claims basically needs a social process of dispute between experts to work. Question number 5 is who are we making recommendations to? Right? Who's our audience? Who are we trying to communicate these things to, and what sort of problems or policy issues are they facing? There are multiple reasons why science could inform policy making. So some of this is, about allowing policymakers to make factually competent decisions, understanding how the world works, the potential that science provides a unique perspective on the impact of policies. That's all assuming it's done well. But there is a very real trap that scientists and researchers can end up validating pre-existing policies. So a policymaker or a policy actor may know very well what they would like to happen, and they may just be seeking kind of endorsement. The project had, as part of its ethical principles that I spoke about at the start, an explicit commitment to non-partisanship, right? So it was never going to provide advice to an individual party, political party. However, one thing to consider is, are partners in the project a potential audience? So PACE includes some NGOs. It includes the city of Reykjavik. So are these actors a potential audience for policy recommendations and policy could make, as well as looking externally to the obvious choices? And my final question that a consortium project should ask itself is, who should make our recommendations? So when we judge McCloskey argued that when we judge an argument, we're also always implicitly judging the speaker. So, that judgment might be made on presentation of class status, or presentation of gender or age, or many of these things. So you're probably doing it now as I speak, even if you don't want to. And this opens up the question of who should represent a consortium, who should provide our recommendations to policymakers. Now, and is the typical strategy of putting forward the most senior researchers the right one, when we know that seniority is unevenly distributed along intersectional terms of age, race, gender, class, ability, things like that? So an open question for a research project is, can we use the policy recommendations activity to actively boost the careers of early stage researchers? Open question of whether our policy audience would listen to that, or whether it's quite used to senior researchers speaking for projects. But also we need to think about, well, are there any risks that come from that, especially in a politically contested space? Is there a risk of putting junior researchers up as a public voice of a project? So that's one of my general kind of questions, like that a project should ask itself. Now I'm going to talk more about the specific dynamics and context of making policy recommendations in the field of populism research. So firstly, obviously, it's a very inherently politicized domain. The topic is essentially politics, essentially contemporary politics. So we're studying contemporary political parties, movements, etc., that are actively contesting political power in our countries right now. The project has some obligation sort of to identify some of the kind of the negative impacts of populism, but we really need to think about how we as a project considered the problem of populism. It's a political one, right? So the outcomes that seem ideal by some are clearly an existential threat to others. Our problem of populism that we're going to address in a project or think about in a project, it can't be simply there are some populist parties and they're winning elections. That's not appropriate. So the decision was made in PACE to focus on the negative impacts of populist politics that we could sort of, separate out from particular politics and sort of say, well, what is happening to societies in relation to these? Now, it's challenging because the very definitions, as I'm sure you're all aware, are politicized. There's a very porous boundary between the mainstream politics and populist outsider challenges. And, populism and populist are both terms of critique used to attack others and badges of identity used to sort of proclaim a particular relationship to the demos. Now, This is hard to manage, but there are some impacts on research communication that we know about. So the honest broker role that Pilker identified becomes more difficult in heavily politicized environments. Politicization has impacts on source credibility. So this is the idea that people in politicized environments make different choices about who to believe, what evidence to accept or reject, and are more likely to reject evidence that contradicts their existing beliefs. Also, this environment creates the risk of intentional politicization. So this is where somebody might introduce doubt or challenge a scientific finding with an explicitly political purpose in mind. Elephant in the room, perhaps, is this risk of skepticism towards the source of research funding affecting the legitimacy of the things we might say as a project. So openly, this project has received funding from the European Union's Horizon 2020 Research and Innovation Programme. And at the same time, we know that criticism of the EU and its institutions has become a hallmark of populist, nativist and anti-democratic movements on the continent. So I think it's worth being open about how this sort of ties together. The goals and ambitions of the larger research programme are set by the European Commission. The individual consortia like us respond to these calls for research with a proposal to do some research, where we sort of define our objectives within that and sort of finesse those things to respond to that call. And then those projects are assessed by external independent experts. So all that being said, there is still potential skepticism towards that every time we put that branding on our outputs. On the other hand, there is no way we would not do that, right? That is, we need to be very transparent about what's paid for the research. It's a very crowded field, so starting to make policy recommendations about populism is intervening in a very crowded field. Now, this is an entirely unsystematic sample, but it gives you an example of the lots of different types of recommendations people have made about how to respond to populism in some way, ranging from radical reform of underlying economic and social problems to communication strategies to restricting immigration, signaling, how the European Union frames its communication message, to philosophical approaches to like de-emphasizing meritocracy, recognizing the dignity of work, encouraging common space, and other things that Michael Sandel wants to do. You can see, even from this unsystematic sample, that these are addressed to a huge range of different actors, make a huge range of assumptions about what the problem of populism is, and make a huge and have wildly different kind of causal mechanisms and theories, about how this works, what this phenomenon is. So when we enter into this space, as we entered into this space, we need to be very clear about how we feel, what we think about these other kind of recommendations, and be very aware that they exist. Are there any of these that we can kind of stand by, or any of these that sort of are contradicted by our research? So, for example, a more useful policy recommendation might be, that very common recommendation you keep getting, we don't believe that's true based on our research. Now, the field of populism is also one that is typified by skepticism towards experts and scientists. During the Brexit debate in the UK, Conservative politician Michael Gove is quite famous now for having said, "I think people in this country have had enough of experts." So the kind of a very critique of expertise, institutional expertise, has been leveraged in certain type of politics. And populist political actors have expressed criticisms of scientists and academic institutions, at various levels of sort of severity and impact. Research studies have found that there are population level associations between having populist attitudes, having populist sentiment, and a mistrust towards intellectuals and experts. And this might tie into different ways that people develop social trust, right? Are they more motivated by close at hand direct democracy you can interact with, or are they more motivated by professional competence or a belief in institutions? I'm going to skip over those factors here, but there are several ways in which researchers can diminish their legitimacy in public view. And essentially, all this ties into this central problematic, which is this kind of relationship between populism, technocracy, and liberalism. Right? So some thinkers, like Esmark here, have suggested that the rise of populist parties is in part a reaction to a technocratic mode of politics, so a mode of politics typified by the exercise of power by experts, very kind of governmental approaches to risk and performance management, and essentially an exclusion of politics from government. So we're operating in a space that where, you know, and this is a case, a long background of writers talking about sort of the politics of depoliticization, the threat to active political contestation from this kind of privileged, closed off, elitist expertise. And even the very idea of policy itself might be criticized from a populist perspective as being kind of technocratic or elitist. It's not democratic ground politics. It's niche interests fiddling around at the margins, yeah, in a way, right? The PACE consortium would be very unlikely to consider ourselves technocrats, but we are attempting to provide policy recommendations. So we have to kind of think about that. So final slide. We'll be publishing a deliverable towards the end, a report towards the end of the project, which wraps this up. But this is a summary of our recommendations to the project about how we should make policy recommendations. So I'll just speed through these and then I'll leave them on the screen. So PACE should reflect on and acknowledge our motivations for making policy recommendations. We need to be open about any conflicts of interest. We should document how we come to our policy recommendations, you know, make that very clear. We need to follow up to avoid the halo effect of expertise. We need to show our working, clearly follow our policy recommendations on from our research, and be very cautious about stepping beyond our findings, conscious of our blind spots. We should seek opportunities to externally sense check our recommendations. Can we get our recommendations kind of almost peer reviewed, you know, not to allow other people to tell us what to recommend, but to kind of get a sense of like, how did you get there? And we need to be transparent about how we pick our audience. The consortium together should identify what roles it and the individual researchers within it wish to play. So I think we obviously need to avoid being stealth policy advocates, be very careful about being policy advocates generally, but if we're being science arbiters, what are the open empirical questions that are important for the policy process that we can meaningfully respond to? If instead we're to be honest brokers, how can our findings open up the scope of available policy options? What have we learned in this research project that can open up the space of, you know, thinking about this type of politics and its impact on our societies? It's quite a broad question, but I think that's a laudable goal of trying to open up new options. And we should collaborate with other honest brokers where possible, kind of thinking of this as a community enterprise. So we should, you know, reach out to other projects, other researchers, and try and sort of build shared policy recommendations where possible. Practically, we should explore in the project how to support early stage researchers to present our recommendations, you know, including giving them the appropriate kind of backup, the opportunities, the kind of backup, the training, the support if things go wrong. We need to be aware of existing policy recommendations in the field of populism. As I said, it's a crowded field. And we need to consider how the problem of populism is being constructed. So how the problem is constructed is often carries with it a hint of a solution in many ways. The project needed to develop a sense of what we consider the negative impacts of populist politics to be, while acknowledging that this is always a political decision, even if we've abstracted away from you know, individual parties winning or losing particular elections. And we have a think about, are there negative impacts that could gain broad, non-partisan political agreement? But even whilst doing that, we should anticipate distrust of our motives and outputs from populist actors. I mean, I would. PACE should be transparent about its policy recommendations and find out how best it can put these out for public consultation. I hope we've done some of this with the democracy labs, for example. Yeah, so we should identify opportunities for peer review of our policy recommendations, some form of peer review or community review of our policy recommendations. So that is where I'm done. Thank you for listening. Thank you for your time. I guess we've got time for discussion and questions now.
Yes, thank you, David. That would be great if there's any questions or discussions, and maybe you can go back to the slides, the last slide, because I thought it was quite interesting to see all these recommendations.
There you go.
Thank you. Bruce, you unmuted.
See if there are any other questions. I've got questions. Okay, well, I'll start. I mean, so what these are good. What isn't there is what is it about the style or the content of recommendations should we do? So, for example, if you say there's a difference between saying we recommend you do X to there are X, Y, and Z possible responses to this with the following pros and cons, to even things that are even vaguer. So different degrees of confidence, communication of reliability, and leaving it up to the context of the policymaker, policy actor, to sort of interpret it in their own situation. What do you think about that, and how that probably relates to one or two of these points? There are a lot of them.
Yeah, I mean, I guess the question, I think, is quite driven by how close to a particular policymaker's agenda you wish to get, right? So whether you, you know, if you're, so it's okay to take an entirely different example from populism. On previous research work, we've been asked at Trilateral to give a set of recommendations on if and how the European Commission should set up a scheme for privacy seals, privacy certifications, right? So we then had a very kind of, you know, concrete bounded thing of what are you trying to achieve in this space, and what we looked at the mechanisms and how other seals would work and things like that, and we could provide very kind of concrete recommendations. Whereas I think we are in the field of populism research, like the end goal is a politically contested thing, right? So an entirely normative kind of thing. It's, in fact, it's like core questions of political theory. How should we organize our societies, and what's the appropriate kind of way of doing that? So that makes it very challenging to do that level of kind of recommendations that are that aren't, you know, entirely normative. You know, this is how I would like the society to be organized. When you kind of, I guess, step down the level of I don't want to say level of analysis, but when you step down a kind of a more granular thing, you have particular questions like, we think there's a low level of public trust in institutions. What could we do about that? I guess there are recommendations that are around opening up that space, explaining that space. You know, these are the options. And I think that's quite a valuable work, particularly, for example, where we have strong beliefs about the causal theories behind populism. That might then open up a series of like, well, this is what we think is happening, and then if you've got a democratic mandate, a legitimacy, you know, that comes from some other source, then someone else can make sort of decisions about how to what to do with that. Yeah, I mean, it's a complex open question.
Sorry,
it's a complex open question, really.
I
think it's but to step back a moment, I think being reflexive about it and being kind of, you know, considered and keeping it as an open thing for discussion. You know, whenever we make a policy recommendation, why and like what are we hoping to intend with it?
I believe Ruja posted in chat that she has a question also.
Thank you, David, for this really thorough presentation of the dilemmas the giving policy recommendation poses. I find this extremely helpful, given that our team is responsible to accumulate all the recommendations our team, the PACE team has. And address it to policy. And so we face a lot of dilemmas related to how to present policy recommendations coming from a very diverse team with some theoretical disagreements, which is, of course, natural. In the scientific community, we very rarely reach full consensus. So one of my dilemmas, for our dilemmas, is how to present recommendations that are not conclusive, given that the document, especially the one that is addressed to stakeholders, should be in the form of a brief. In order to get the attention of the policymakers, we need to be as concise as possible and as categorical, not including our doubts about, because if we include doubts, it's just only going to create more confusion than. So how to approach this? Concise, not full with, one scholar says this, another scholar says that, there is this tradition, that tradition. So how to be honest that there is disagreement in the field on particular issues, and nevertheless not sound too hesitant in the recommendations, and provide something useful as an advice to policymakers. The first question. And the second question is, do we warn policy recommendation? I think it's very important to do it, but I'm not sure how to do it. Do we warn when we realize, as based on our research, that there are some deeply misleading recommendations that have been given in the past, that in our opinion as a consortium, we believe shouldn't be followed? So do we have a negative part in our policy recommendations, or we stick to the positive message?
I'll answer your second question first, if I may. I think yes. I think if that, every person and their dog has some recommendations about how to engage in the field of kind of populist politics, and some of those are well-founded and others are not, and others are pushing an agenda that people held anyway, and so on and so forth. And I think where we identify things in our research that suggest that those recommendations would be actively harmful, or perhaps even just not capable of achieving the goals, their own goals, so internally inconsistent, I think we should call that out. I think if we have a firm research basis for saying, I'm sorry, that very popular policy option is going to backfire, I think that's something that came out of the foresight scenarios work we've been doing, is that it's actually very easy for, because of the complexity of the space, it's very easy for policy interventions to have some kind of negative effect that sort of makes the situation worse in some way. So I think yes, I think is the most straightforward answer I can give you is yes, I think we should do that. To your first question, I'm quite taken with the idea of nested communication. So you take advantage of the fact that you can put multiple kind of communications out at different levels of kind of granularity. So I think we should be very transparent about all our kind of doubts and our uncertainties, and the extent to which we've put clear research thought into a conclusion, and then we do a much more concise kind of punchy summary of the areas where we have got some consensus, or we have got a kind of firm finding. So we don't have to address everything in the field. We should maybe be quite selective about, I know that the temptation is to say we have a huge raft of recommendations, but if we come out with 2 or 3 or 4 ones we're very confident about, that actually might be more effective, and then elsewhere we show our working. And if someone is motivated enough to kind of follow the chain, from the in your initial kind of short brief, you provide links to the more in-depth analysis. If someone is motivated to follow the chain and look at your working, they can do, So I think I would think there's some merit in that approach.
I believe Magnus unmuted himself. Do you want to say anything, Magnus? Maybe not. Okay.
Okay, I'm going to ask one more question. All of these recommendations are good recommendations, but the opposite danger is also a danger, that you are so cautious about stuff that you don't make any recommendations at all. This happened during the UK foot and mouth disease over the process of the crisis. Because the recommendations that the scientists were making, all the caveats were cut off as the recommendations went up the chain, the scientists progressively concluded less and less and less and less until they were concluding nothing at all because they didn't want it to be taken out of context. How we have to avoid that as well, don't we?
Yes, and I think there's going to be some fantastic case studies coming out of the pandemic about how scientific advice encounters political processes. I mean, there's a field of research on this that's well established, but I think there's going to be interesting case studies on how I think that relationship changes. Different types and modes of governance kind of have a different relationship to scientific expertise and incorporate it in sort of different ways and reject it in different ways. So for a sense of how that happens now with these institutions that we have, is going to be an event that's happened globally. Provides a lot. I mean, it's been a horrible experience, but from a kind of a research perspective on looking at how science gets pulled into policymaking and how it doesn't, it's going to be an invaluable set of sort of information and data. And I think from what I understand of it, you sort of will lose control of your recommendations of your research outputs at some point. That is sort of inevitable. One advice I was given once was sort of simplify as much as you can, because someone else is going to simplify it for you otherwise, and then you can
that's like Albert Einstein's tongue-in-cheek theory should be as simple as possible but not simpler, but you never know where that line is. Can I, on that basis, remind people, if they don't know, that the next week there is a 2021 EU conference on modelling for policy support, which is free, but you have to register to go and listen to the sessions. It includes sessions about interaction between policymakers and getting the right modelling and everything like that. I have a paper there next week about model comparison and the importance of that, but there are lots of other relevant papers to these sorts of themes. Anyway, plug over. Andre, I mean, maybe Andre wants to, does Andre want to voice his question or just go it in text? There's a question there. Maybe there should be stated how reliable in percentages or feasible are these recommendations, etc. Okay, he can't talk. It's too noisy in his room where he's talking about.
Yeah, I'm cautious about percentages, because I don't know where those numbers would come from, and I think they might give a kind of a fault. On many of the things we're looking at, they would give a kind of false certainty, and that actually might be more of a risk. And even with sort of feasibility, likelihood, I'm reminded always of a fantastic study somebody did where they basically asked loads of people what they thought likely, unlikely, very likely, etc. were in percentage terms, and you get a massive distribution across the range. So people might think that very likely is something over 50%, and other people might think that very likely is 99% likely. So there's a huge kind of variation in those things. But pragmatically, I think that being said, some effort to say this we are very confident about, these things we are less confident about, and these things essentially here be dragons. We don't know, we're off the map.
You could obviously often give examples, so you can say, I don't know, it's like a poker game in the last stages. There are 3 possibilities, but you're not sure which one it is. Or we know that these are all possibilities, but we have no idea about the probabilities. or something like that.
Yeah, so that's
qualitative indications of reliability and precision.
Yeah, so in the foresight scenario work that we did, we kind of have a sort of probability space, right? So on one axis you have a prevalence of populist related attitudes amongst population. On the other axis you have sort of mechanisms for bringing that into political efficacy. So, you know, from like high to low on both axes. So that kind of encompasses that. So therefore our aim there was to create scenarios that encompass the kind of the entire probability space. So a society is going to be in one of those quadrants. Like we can't make any percentage predictions about where it's going to be, but we have kind of attempt to map out the space. And sometimes that's the option. Okay, I think that if we're sort of, there's a question there. Are you aware of existing recommendations in the field of populism? Yeah, I mean, just open a newspaper. But there's that list of that. So if I go back a few slides, I'll show you that list of. No, I stopped sharing my screen. No. Pressing the wrong buttons. So this was a very unsystematic sample. You know, some of these are academic studies, some of these are journalists, some of these are think tanks, some of these are philosophers, some of these are politicians. You know, so there's a sort of swathe of sources of existing policy recommendations. You know, quite common ones are, I think I haven't got a quote for it because it turned up in so many places, but quite common ones are, you know, if there's a disconnect between people and politics that populist actors are in some way sort of taking advantage of, then perhaps what we need to do is recognize that as a sort of social problem. You know, populist parties aren't the problem, it's the fact that there's this kind of disconnect between people and politics. So maybe we need to do more citizen engagement, right? Maybe we need to put more participatory deliberative mechanisms into decision-making processes, right? So that's quite a common recommendation, as is the messaging, right? So the idea that institutions just need to sort of explain their politics better in some way, in some kind of sort of marketing branding way. So those are quite common recommendations in the field. The report will, I'm not sure when this one will be published now, but this full report on the ethics of this stuff will be a public document on the PACE project website towards the end of the project, and it will include this unsystematic sample. But there are probably some meta studies out there, I think, on looking at different policy options.
Okay, well, if there are no further questions, I'd like to thank David for his presentation and, of course, all his work during the project. And thank everyone for attending. The project website, if you're interested in more of the details, is pop&ce for populism and civic engagement.eu, and you can get more information there. Thank you, everyone, for attending.
Yeah, thanks for coming, everybody.